All right, welcome everyone to our event, See Yourself in Science, a chat with future scientists. I'm Abbey Thompson. I'm an educator from Stanford's Department of Genetics. I am also the current tech geneticist at the Tech Interactive, which means that I work with the Tech's experience development team to create and develop new experiences in the biotinkering lab. I received my own PhD from Stanford Genetics in 2018, where I studied evolutionary genetics. A few housekeeping items before we get started with our event. I would like you to know that our program today is being recorded. And as always, we would like to thank all of the Tech Interactive supporters, especially our members. We also want to make sure that you know about the Tech Interactive at home and the Tech Interactive in Casa. We're working really hard to bring you free, fun STEM learning you can make do with materials you find around your home. We are still finding new ways to inspire the innovator, and we hope you'll join us in that journey. Also, be sure to look out for our member newsletter to make sure you get early access to all of those activities and upcoming member webinars. We're going to get started with our program. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end, so please do put any questions you might have in the chat. We'll be monitoring them there, and then we'll be asking the panelists all of your different questions. I'd like to briefly introduce our three panelists that we have here today. Alexa is a bioengineer who is passionate about STEM education and science communication. She is currently working towards 2 graduate degrees at Stanford, a PhD in bioengineering and a master's in education. When not in the lab, you can often find Alexa with her fiance and her very many pets. Kelsey is currently working on her PhD in genetics at Stanford. When she's not busy with her research in the lab, you might find her gardening, playing board games, and watching far too much Netflix. Miles is a genetic counseling student at Stanford, where he is working towards a master's program in human genetics and genetic counseling. Miles balances his academic and career interests through attending Stanford athletic events, surfing, and yoga. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to our three panelists who will tell you a little bit about themselves before opening it up to general Q&A. So we're going to start today with Alexa. Alexa, take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name's Alexa. And I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you all. So just to start, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So right now, as Abby said, I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and I live on Stanford's campus with my fiance, Francis, and we have 5 pet rats. Their names are Mushu, Abu, Sven, Pua, and Miko. And in my free time, when I'm not working in the lab or teaching, I like to dance. I've been doing ballet basically my whole life. I also do archery, and I really like playing video games, which right now means playing a lot of Animal Crossing. And in my free time, I also like to learn new things, and right now I'm trying to learn Japanese. So obviously I was not always a student at Stanford, and I grew up in New Jersey, so over on the other side of the country. I grew up right next to the beach, so my family and I, both growing up and when I go visit home now, spend a lot of time on the beach or on a boat or fishing, and I really enjoy getting to spend time with my younger brother and sister and my parents doing things outside. And so between being in New Jersey and coming to Stanford, I went to high school and college. So for high school, I went to a special magnet school in New Jersey called Biotechnology High School. And I decided to go there because in 7th grade, I took a life science class and we got to dissect a worm, and I thought that was pretty cool. And so I decided I wanted to study biology. So in my high school, I took a lot of biology classes, but also physics and math, and I found that I really enjoyed science in general, but also math. And when thinking about what I might want to study in college, I was thinking if you add science and math together, you probably get something like engineering. And I decided to major in bioengineering because biology was my favorite subject. So with that in mind, I applied to colleges and ended up attending Cornell in New York. And while I was at Cornell, I did a lot of things, including taking classes, still dancing, making new friends, even sometimes playing video games still. But I think the most important thing I did in college was research. So at Cornell, I worked with a professor named Dr. Jonathan Butcher, who's on the right in this picture. And we studied a disease called calcific aortic valve disease. So you have valves in your heart that are typically made of pretty soft tissue. But in this disease, they start to get deposits of calcium, which makes them kind of like bone. So instead of having the soft heart tissue, you get sort of hard bone-like tissue, which means that the heart valves don't really function very well. And we were trying to understand what causes the disease and how we might be able to treat it. And when I worked with Dr. Butcher, I worked more directly with a PhD student named Jen. And Jen taught me a lot about research and also about being a PhD student. So that's why I decided to apply to Stanford. And now working at Stanford, I work with Dr. Joe Wu, who's in the top right corner, and we study heart disease. So we use a type of cells called induced pluripotent stem cells, which we get by taking blood from adult patients with their permission, of course. And then we can turn that blood into the stem cells, and then we can turn the stem cells into heart muscle. And that way we don't have to take out part of people's heart muscle to actually be able to study their heart. And so these two videos on the left is the cells on just a plate, and you can hopefully see them beating. And then we can also make like three-dimensional tissues using these cells that will also beat. And I think the coolest project I have worked on so far is we sent some of these cells to the International Space Station so that we could figure out how the change in gravity affects the cells. And so looking forward and thinking about what I might want to do in the future, because I think I have about a year left in my PhD. I know I really enjoy science and engineering, but I also really enjoy teaching and talking to people about my science and research. And so I think in a future career, I would want to have a role where I get to tell people about how awesome science is. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Kelsey.
Great, thanks, Alexa. So my name's Kelsey. I'm also a graduate student at Stanford. So I grew up on Long Island, which is in New York. I was really into gardening. On the left are some sunflowers that I grew. And I also liked to go to the beach and spend a lot of time there. And in high school, I knew I really liked science, but I didn't really know what that meant or what it meant to be a scientist, or even if I could be one. Being a scientist kind of felt like being a superhero. So I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I was interested in science and specifically biology. And so then, like Alexa, I also went off to Cornell, which was absolutely beautiful campus, but also very snowy sometimes. And at Cornell, I started to learn a lot more about what it meant to be a scientist, and I joined a research lab there. And there's a picture of the research lab that I worked in, and we studied this cute little organism on the right that has these little hair-like projections called cilia that are used to swim around in ponds. So we studied this organism, and my research there really showed me what it meant to be a researcher. And so I applied to graduate school to become a scientist. So now at Stanford, I get to do lots of cool science, including so we study how cells can start off from one cell and then replicate all of the DNA inside to generate two cells. And the picture on the left is a tube with some DNA in it. And then in the middle, we can load that onto an actual DNA sequencer that can tell us all of the base pairs within the DNA. In addition to some really cool science, I also made really great friends. These are some of my classmates from my genetics program. And I also got involved in mentoring. And this is a photo of my group from the Stanford Summer Research Program, which is a program that brings undergraduate students from all over to Stanford to do research for the summer. And so I had the wonderful opportunity of learning about these students and also helping them with their research and learning how to present their research. So I really love these, two aspects of really cool science and mentoring and outreach. And in the future, I hope to tie those together and potentially be a professor or some type of teaching role. And in addition to all of these things, I also still love to garden. And here's a picture of my garden now, which is especially important now that we're at home all the time, and this is where I spend my afternoons. So with that, I'll pass it on to Miles.
Thanks, Kelsey. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'm Miles. I'm a rising second-year genetic counseling student. I'm in the 2 years master's program in human genetics and genetic counseling at Stanford. Genetic counseling might seem a little alien to some of you, but I hope to give you guys some insight into what we do in our little introduction here. But first, let me tell you a little bit about myself and my journey to where I am right now. So this is me. I love to surf. I love biology, especially the study of genes. I love to travel. That picture second from the right is me and my girlfriend in Bali. We were there last summer. And then that picture on the right is me and my family at my graduation ceremony, and I graduated from UCLA. So yeah, I went to UCLA for undergrad, and as you can imagine, I got a little less snow than Alexa and Kelsey did. I was on the sailing team, and I sailed in the Pacific Coast Conference with other schools up and down the coast. I also did some wet lab research work in a cancer biology lab. And I did this for the first 2 years. And at the end of my sophomore year, I kind of started to, get sick of pipetting and started to question if lab research was the path for me. So I wanted to balance this with a major that was a little less hard sciencey and that aimed to bridge the gap between the life sciences and the social sciences. And this major was called the Human Biology and Society major, offered through the Institute of Society and Genetics at UCLA. And what we did was study and address many important sciencey and medical things through a social lens and a lot of social issues through a biological lens. So we learned about current issues in public health, medical ethics, and the role of genetics in this growing field of personalized medicine. As you can imagine, this is where I learned a lot about human genetics and the role of a genetic counselor. I became very interested and started looking for places where I could be in the clinic, observing and shadowing what a genetic counselor does. And after a couple times being in clinic, I was sure that this is what I wanted to do. And if there's one piece of advice I can give is to really just shadow as much as you can, like get into the clinic, get into the lab, and see what it's like for yourself in person. I think that's the best way to truly find where your passions may lie. So I thought I'd give some background about what exactly a genetic counselor does because it is such a new profession. Genetic counselors are healthcare professionals with specialized skills in areas of both medical human genetics and counseling. And it is the process, or genetic counseling is the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. So for example, we have conversations with our patients about how inherited diseases and conditions might affect them or their families, how family and medical histories may impact the chance of disease occurrence or recurrence, and which genetic tests may or may not be right for them, and what those test results tell. So in essence, I see the role of a genetic counselor as a mix between being a biology teacher with an expertise in genetics and a psychologist with experience in helping people in tough life situations. Genetic counselors can specialize in a lot of different specialties. And if you're wondering if that's Angelina Jolie on the cover of that Time magazine, you're absolutely right. The Angelina effect was this big wave of interest generated in the public about how the study of our genes can impact our health. And it all stemmed from Angelina Jolie discovering that she had a family history of breast and ovarian cancer in her family. She decided to then go have genetic counseling and genetic testing. And through that, she found that she was at an increased risk for breast cancer. And so knowing this, she decided to get a mastectomy, which is a procedure to remove some breast tissue. And that significantly reduced her lifetime risk of getting breast cancer. So cancer genetics is a big specialty, and there's also prenatal genetics, assisted reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization, cardiovascular genetics, pediatric genetics where you work with kids, and etc. So this is where I am now in that photo. That's me two from the right, and these are my classmates. As you can see, it's predominantly female, and this is true of the profession in general. But overall, there is a push and active and conscious push towards increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field. Another thing you might notice is that, there's not many of us. It's a small class, and it is a small profession too. I think there's only like 8,000 genetic counselors nationwide. But with the rising use of genetics in modern medicine, I expect that number to, consistently be growing. Right after graduation, I envision myself working in a clinic or a hospital setting for a while. And then one day, way in the future, I hope to be a professor of some kind of education role to give back the same way so many have given to me. And yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you to all three of you for giving us a bit of an introduction and idea of who you are and what you do. At this point, we're going to move to more of a discussion format to have a lot of questions for our panelists that they'll talk a bit more about what they do. So if you have questions for them, please do submit them in the chat, and we'll be asking them as we go forward. As we're waiting for people to continue submitting questions, I wanted to start off by asking all of you, briefly, thinking about what you do day to day. What is your favorite part of what you do on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis, either now while your work may be a little different or even before you started working from home?
Yes, I can go. I would say my favorite part currently, I think, especially since things have changed, is I can go into the lab and do a little bit of science, and it's definitely different from how it would be if there wasn't a global pandemic, but I can still interact with my colleagues. So if I do an experiment and I have some results and I want to talk about it, I can just message anybody in my lab and we can talk about the results. And I really love talking through those problems. It's kind of like a puzzle to me. So I think that's my favorite part about it. And like I said, it is pretty different from how it used to be before the pandemic, but it's still, I think, a key part of what I love about being a researcher.
I think my favorite part of my day-to-day is getting to be involved in teaching. So I've been a teaching assistant for a couple of classes at Stanford, and I really love working with other people and talking about science and getting to explain science concepts and work with them on problems. So I've taught like a biodesign class for high school students on campus over the summer, and getting to work with the teams and think about problems, but also get to teach people. I think that's been one of my favorite parts.
I think one of my favorite parts of doing what I'm doing is, as of this summer, I started a rotation in pediatric genetics. So I work with kids and their families as we help to navigate them through complex situations, talking about care and management. A lot of them have different genetic conditions. Some have Down syndrome, some have autism. So I think my favorite part is just working with these kiddos and helping them, maximize their fullest potential and making sure that we're caring for them the best way we can.
Thank you all. And we have a question for Kelsey from the audience. Kelsey, can you tell us some projects you worked on with your mentees over the summer? How can other students connect with mentoring programs like these?
Yeah, there's actually a ton of mentoring programs like that at Stanford or at any university. So I think it depends on the program for what kind of mentoring experience it is. For the Stanford Summer Research Program, I was mostly helping the students, they're working in their own research labs, and then part of the program is learning how to talk about your science and, you know, explain what you've been working on in a way that other people can understand. So mostly what I helped them with was communicating their science, and, you know, just talking through what it would be like to go to grad school. There are so many opportunities like that, and I think seeking them out actually will lead you to find that there are too many. Like, you can't participate in all of them, unfortunately. But there's, in addition to mentoring undergraduate students, there's plenty of opportunities to teach and mentor younger students, like at the Tech, where we've hosted modules, science modules, to show children or students different science experiments and things like that.
Thank you. A question from Ashok. Is it hard to work outside of the lab? So thinking about how you maybe did things in person before COVID-19, how has that transition been to outside for any of you?
I can start. It's definitely been difficult because my lab works with human cells a lot. They take a lot of care. So the way we feed the cells, we put this liquid called media on them to keep them happy and healthy. And we have to do that every day. And so if we can't come into the lab, we can't do those types of experiments. Thankfully, Stanford has started reopening some of the lab space, and we're a little bit limited in terms of how long we can be there. And we have to go in shifts so that there's not too many people in the space at once. But when we were all working from home, we couldn't do experiments, but I still had writing to do. So one of the things, in addition to doing experiments, is we have to actually write papers and then publish them so that everyone else can learn about what we did. And so I was doing a lot of that work from home when I couldn't go into the lab.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think the other thing I started to realize now that we can't go into lab as frequently as before is doing things that you can do on the computer, like writing, or some type of computational biology if you want to analyze DNA sequences or protein types or whatever thing. There are a lot of ways to do research that are entirely computational, and I think actually I've learned a lot just recently from having to work at home. So
I have a question for Miles from Jamie. What's been your favorite memory in the genetic counseling program at Stanford?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot. Game nights with my classmates. That's always fun. Being in the clinic, I think every time I'm in the clinic with a new patient, it's always a new case, a new family. Every case is different. That's all, so it's hard to pinpoint one specific one, but I'm grateful that I have that opportunity to do that. And then one thing that sticks out in particular is we volunteered in this program called Operation House Call, which basically is a program where they send volunteers to families who have children with Down syndrome. And so I actually went to this one family's home and got to see what, day-to-day life was like with Down syndrome and meet the family. And I'll never forget that experience.
Now we have a question from the audience from Lauren. Could you talk a little bit about internships and what year it is important to start looking for them while you're still in college?
Yeah, I could start. I don't think there's like a specific year that is a particularly good time to start looking. I think it's never too early and it's never too late. If you're interested in something, go for it. Go experience what it's like. And if you are a late bloomer, you haven't figured it out yet, it's never too late to start late. I took a gap year, so I didn't really start internships till like my senior year. I did some part-time work, and then during my gap years when I did some full-time internships, and that's when I that was what worked for me. I think everyone is a little different, and recognize their interest at a different time.
Yeah, I can talk about that too. So I guess I didn't really do any traditional like internships at a company. I did in both my sophomore and my junior year of college, I did research programs. So my sophomore year summer, I stayed at Cornell and worked in the same lab that I worked in during the year. And then my junior year, I did a different research program at Johns Hopkins. And so I agree with Miles. Like, I don't know that there's a absolute best time to start doing it. I think if you're interested in doing science and going to grad school, it's important to have some research experience, but I don't know that it's that important exactly when or where you do it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, especially for the PhD. Research experience in some form is pretty essential if you want to do a PhD, even if it's not called a traditional internship. You can find a lot of those experiences at any major research university. And if your college doesn't have those, you can often find programs at other universities such as Stanford where you can do summer experiences. Another question from the audience for Alexa. What uses are there for the heart tissue that you've synthesized?
That's a great question. So the thing we use them for most right now is to study disease and to test drugs. And so we make the 3D heart tissue instead of just keeping the cells on the plate, because the heart cells in your heart are not just on a flat plate, they're in tissue and there's stuff around them that we call extracellular matrix. And so having the cells in a tissue format lets us make it look a little bit more like it actually would in the body. And so we can take those iPS cells or the induced pluripotent stem cells that I talked about before that we turn into heart muscle, and then make those into tissues. And we can get them from lots of different kinds of patients. So patients with heart disease and patients who are healthy, and then compare the diseased tissue to the healthy tissue. And then we can also test different types of medications on the diseased tissue so that we can figure out how we might be able to help the patients. There's also the potential for it to be used in what we call regenerative medicine. So actually taking that tissue and then putting it back on someone's heart. For example, if someone had a heart attack and part of their heart tissue dies, we might be able to help them recover, but we're not quite there yet. There are still some issues in terms of getting the tissue to survive in someone's heart and whether or not it actually improves their heart function after they have a heart attack, for example. So that's a potential use in the future, but we're not quite there yet.
A question for Miles, although Alexa and Kelsey might want to chime in on it afterwards as well. Miles, do people ask you questions about their own genetic makeup, and what are they usually worried about?
Yeah, all the time. I think the first question they ask is, wait, what do you do again? Because it's so esoteric. I think that a lot of the times, because of like the mainstream sensationalism with 23andMe and Ancestry.com and things like that, people always ask about what their ancestry is and all that, and where they're from. And I don't really have an expertise in that at all. So it's hard for me to answer those questions. But, sometimes people come to me and they're like, oh, I have a family history of this and that. And then, it really depends on what that family history looks like. It's hard to not fall into my genetic counseling role when I'm just going about my normal day and it's just a normal social interaction. So I try not to get too medical, but I try to give them an overview of, what I think could be going on. Yeah.
The only thing I would add on to that is I think a lot of times, in media, genetics is kind of described as this like written rule book that, sort of describes who you are. But I think genetics is actually way more complicated than many people realize. And so, even if you knew all of the DNA sequence in your body, you might not really be able to get as much information from that, just because our understanding of of how genetics turns into a human is still kind of in progress. That's what we're working on. So I think it's less of a rule book, more of a something that can help inform health rather than, you know, decide the answer usually.
I can also give a little bit more on that. One of my roles at the Tech is to be the Tech Geneticist, where I answer questions about genetics from people from all around the world. So I answer probably hundreds of them every year. And as Miles said, there's a really deep interest in ancestry, interpreting those results, interpreting results from 23andMe, Ancestry, DNA. People are often quite worried about variants that maybe they were told they have this risk for something and don't understand what that means to them and to their health. And exactly as Kelsey said, there's often this idea that it's this hard and fast rule book when it's really not. It's really very complicated. It has a lot of other things that aren't just genetics as well. So if I had one thing that I wish people could better understand, it would be that genetics isn't the answer to everything. It doesn't control your destiny at all. There's a lot of things that also influence that, and a lot of people get very concerned for less reason than necessary. Another question from the audience for all of you: what careers are you interested in? Recognizing you're at a transition point in your lives right now, what do you want to do next, or what do you want to do long term? What do you hope to do in your future?
I want to be a genetic counselor. I think I'll start with that. You know, I think I want to start in like a clinic, hospital setting, like I mentioned earlier. There's also a big growing field in industry and a lot of like genetic testing companies, not like 23andMe and Ancestry, but like companies that are more medically and health based, clinically certified labs and stuff like that. So working at one of those companies could be an option. And then down the road, you know, I think it would be great to give back, because I couldn't have got where I am without shadowing all the genetic counselors that I did. And so, you know, either whether it be taking on students to be supervisee, to supervise, or, you know, take up some kind of education role, I think that would be my long-term goal.
I'll go next. I think I want to be a scientist. And that can take many forms, and I'm kind of excited to figure out which form I want to pursue. At least I know that I'm really passionate about mentoring, and so and that's because, you know, like Miles said, I, you know, wouldn't be where I am without the mentors that I had. And I am a first generation college student, and so I realized there's several barriers that exist for plenty of other students like me or who have other disadvantages. And I am passionate about finding ways around those barriers and helping other students find ways around them. And so I think I want to tie those things together and hopefully do some type of professorship, or could be any type of scientist role. It could be in industry like Miles talked about, or at a university where I am now.
Yeah, so I mentioned sort of that I want to have some role where I get to help people learn about science. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, which is something that Kelsey just mentioned, is that there are definitely barriers that exist in science, and you can definitely see how that results in there's like a lot of the bioengineering, at least, is in the graduate level, it's pretty split male-female. But in terms of like racial and ethnic diversity, it's still not very diverse. And once you move up past graduate school into professors, it definitely gets more heavily male and also very white. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is how I can use teaching to try to make science and engineering more accessible to more people. So that might look like being a teacher myself, or helping other science educators and teachers become better teachers so that they can help and support more and more diverse students in learning and having access to science and engineering. So that could look like working in teaching support at a university, or yeah, something like that. So not quite sure yet, but I'm excited regardless.
Adding on to that slightly, maybe Alexa and Kelsey, can you talk about what types of things are sort of typical for people to do with a PhD in biology? What are the various options and routes that you might take getting a PhD, such as yours?
Well, I think the most common and the most obvious one is becoming a professor, which is, I think, what people tend to think of when they hear of people who have PhDs, is that the most obvious pathway is then to do a postdoctoral research position. So after you get your doctorate, do more research and then eventually become a professor. But it's actually not that common in terms of the number of people who get PhDs and the number of professors that there are in the country and the world. So a lot of people with PhDs go on to do research positions in industry. So working, for example, at a biotech company, either doing research to design drugs or doing technical writing to support and communicate what the industry is doing to the people who use the product or the general public. So there are lots of different options that exist. But yeah, I don't know if Kelsey, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and I think actually I'm still definitely learning all of the different things you can do with a PhD. I think it really depends on kind of what you're interested in. So you could do science writing or science writing editing. So, you know, reading through and editing articles that are submitted to different scientific journals, or something like Abbey, you know, doing something that's more focused on science communication. Or I think there's just so many options, but still learning.
Another question from the audience, if you want to pull out your high school biology history lessons, what are some of your favorite famous genetics experiments? Maybe ones that inspired you to pursue this field or ones that you found surprising or shocking?
I got a good one for this. So there's a famous scientist, Barbara McClintock, who studied these things called transposable elements, which are like these weird segments of DNA that can actually move around in the genome. So our genome's like all of our DNA in each of our cells. And so there are actually pieces of DNA that can copy themselves and insert themselves elsewhere in the genome. And that just kind of blew my mind when I learned about that. And that was what really got me excited about science. That to me is just totally crazy that there are these genetic elements that can move, and actually learning about them, that, you know, seems to be a key part of evolution of DNA.
Um, I mean, I think it's hard to, have a conversation about genetics these days without talking about CRISPR. So I'll open that can of worms. So for those of you who don't know, CRISPR is basically Microsoft spell check for genetics. They basically can go into a gene, find out if there's a mutation or a change that might be causing some kind of disease, and edit that out for a working gene. And last year, I think, or 2 years ago, some professor in China had genetically engineered the first human embryos, and those babies were born. They were twins. He had genetically engineered them to be resistant to HIV, and this sparked huge backlash in the scientific community because he was just jumping way too many guns ethically and socially. We're just not ready for that yet. With this super powerful technology comes a lot of potential for good, because a lot of human diseases can be cured. But at the same time, there's the chance that we can use this technology for not so good, and actually cause a lot more just discrimination and inequalities as we make a judgment about which traits are desirable and which are not, and we just don't want to head down that route. That's something about genetics that really stood out to me. I think it's something that we need to be careful about, and something that, you know, as a society we should be thinking about, because it really does affect us as a species. So yeah.
I think that's a great thing to bring up, Miles. I think that idea of how this could impact us going forward is really important. I would encourage anyone who's interested in finding about some shocking or horrible experiments in biology, definitely I would recommend reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. That is a very good story to read. It's both a good book and has a lot about ethical dilemmas and mistakes scientists have made. It's also important to learn about the Tuskegee study and how different groups have been mistreated by science over the last many decades and what that has done to various mistrust. There's plenty of them to learn about, and it's something that I think is really important for scientists today to know about all of these things. I don't know if Alexa, if you wanted to add something else about any experiments that maybe were famous, shocking, infamous, that you
I think the first one that jumped into my head was Dolly the sheep. So just hearing about how they had cloned a sheep by taking, I think it was they took the DNA from the adult sheep's nucleus and put it in basically an embryo and then grew it into a whole nother sheep with the same genetics. When I first heard about that, I thought it was pretty incredible. And it sort of sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. So yeah, that was the one that jumped out at me.
A question for any of you. I guess let's start with Kelsey. What skills, abilities, and personal attributes do you think are important in your job or jobs like this? And what type of people do you think might be drawn to this type of work?
It's an interesting question. I think that the skills and attributes are kind of, it depends on the person. And actually we need kind of, I think the science community needs people with all sorts of skills and attributes. I would say though, research has a lot of failure in it. You know, for every experiment that goes right, there's probably 10 to 20 that went wrong. And so I think resilience and, you know, not getting shut down in the face of failure is a key attribute. And that's something to learn through grad school too. So I think that is really important. General, just like interest in science, you know, if it's something that you're passionate about, it's something that you can push yourself to do. Whereas if you're just doing it, you know, because you, I don't know, aren't super passionate about it, but you thought it could be cool, then it might be harder to stay dedicated even when things aren't going super well. But I think anybody could be a scientist as long as they want to.
I can add that I think one skill that's really important to being a scientist that maybe isn't emphasized enough is communication. And that's because a big part of being a scientist is not just doing the science, but being able to tell other people about it. If you do a bunch of experiments and you understand what it means, but you're not able to tell everyone else why it's important, then no one's going to understand why you wanted to do that in the first place. So being able to talk to people about what science or research you're doing and why it's important is really important too.
Yeah, those were all great points. And I think if there's one thing I could add is that, you know, I think being open-minded and having empathy as a scientist is also very important. You know, a lot of people don't have it as good as us, and, you know, health inequalities affect us differently. You know, there's, as we can see, you know, there's disparate health outcomes depending on who we are and which populations we're in. So as scientists, you know, I think we have that responsibility to make sure that everyone's cared for regardless of gender, race, ethnicity. And so being open-minded and caring about these things and well, that does go a long way.
One slightly different question on a bit of a different track. What kind of college major is required to go to grad school in your field? I know it's a little bit related to what skills, so are there any majors that you would recommend or view as essential?
For genetic counseling specifically, um, I don't know if there was a specific major that was required as like a prerequisite to applying for the program. I think something in the life sciences, in generally speaking, and then maybe a genetics class or two. Um, but I think they also appreciate a holistic education. So your electives, your humanities are also just as important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think um, for a biology PhD, generally, yeah, anything in the life sciences or engineering. I think pretty much any science. I would say like, yeah, like Miles said, like taking a couple genetics course or whatever field you want to go into, courses that are specific to that, and that will actually like I think help understand if that is something that you're interested in doing. But actually, I think it's really important to have people from all different majors in PhD programs, or biology PhD programs. You can imagine an engineer might solve a problem differently from maybe a biologist, or a mathematician. So I think most majors would be great perspectives, and it's just a matter of what the actual graduate program requires. So some programs require a certain number of biology or genetics or cell biology courses, and that depends on the school. But overall, I think science majors in general would be a good fit for PhD program.
Yeah, I think bioengineering is similar in that bioengineering actually covers a pretty wide range in terms of what people do for research. So I have friends who work on genetics, I have friends who work on with cells, and then I have friends who work with robotics. And so there's like a pretty wide range in terms of the type of research people do. So people come to the bioengineering program, at least at Stanford, from a pretty wide range of backgrounds. And outside of making sure that you've taken like any required classes, I honestly think as long as you have some research experience, you could pretty much have any major. So as long as you had some research experience in the required classes, I think it's less important what your actual major is.
And then last question of the day for all three of you. Thinking back to high school or college, is there anything you wish you had known then or you wish you had done differently? Let's start with Miles.
I mean, ooh, put me on the spot there. I think, I wouldn't have done anything differently because, what I've done, whether good or bad, has gotten me to where I am. Um, yeah. Come back. Can you come back to me on this one? Sorry.
I can take the heat off. So I think I doubted myself a lot in high school and in college, and even now, it's something that I really struggle with. And for a long time, I thought, doubts were sort of part of the game. And actually, I'm starting to realize that it seems to be some people tend to doubt themselves more, and that's not necessarily just part of the game. But also, it did actually affect the way that I experienced, like, for instance, graduate school interviews. I spent a lot of time worrying, thinking I wasn't going to get in, rather than really putting forth my best self. So it's a hard thing to say that I wish I would have done differently because, we don't all always have control over the things that make us doubt ourselves. But it is something that I look back on and think that I shouldn't have doubted myself so much. And, I did go for the things that I wanted to go for, but if I had had more confidence in what I could do, then maybe, you know, my experience going for those things would have been different. And it's something that I'm still working on.
Yeah, I think I don't really have anything major that I would go back and change. I like to joke with my dad because when I was applying to colleges, I said I wanted to major in education and he told me I couldn't do that. So I didn't. But now I'm studying education in addition to bioengineering. And I think that I'm actually kind of grateful that I did it this way because it let me sort of get a really strong science background in addition to learning about education. And so I don't know that there was anything I would go back and change necessarily, other than maybe picking a graduate school that's closer to home, because I wasn't expecting to be stuck here in the middle of a pandemic. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think going off of Kelsey and Alexa's comments there, I think the most important thing is to chase what you're really passionate about. I know that sounds trite, but like doing things and getting involved in research labs or internships or whatever just to make your resume look good. I mean, it may get you where you need to go, but like, will that give you the fulfillment? I don't know. So if there's one thing I'd say, you know, is I probably did a little bit of that. Yeah, just mind that, like, you know, whatever you're committing yourself to, that you're constantly reflecting and thinking about whether, you know, this is right for me or whether this is something I'm really passionate about. And I think that'll bring you far.
Well, thank you. I think that is a great note to end on. I would like to thank all three of you for giving us your time, and to everyone who's been listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Before we go, we do want to let you know that the Tech is teaming up with Zanato's Family Markets in offering a membership to to their essential workers with every membership purchase. So please feel free to tell your friends how much you've enjoyed your membership and encourage them to support us and Zanatos as well. Our next member event will be on September 9th, where we'll be joined by Manuel Calderon de la Barca Sanchez, a UC Davis physics professor and the star of the large format film Secrets of the Universe. This family-friendly virtual event will feature clips from the film and a Q&A. Members get first access to sign up, so do sign up soon as spots are limited. And be sure to check us out as part of the Family Garden at Silicon Valley Pride on August 29th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Try our inflatables activity and hear more about one of our biologists behind the activity Making with Microbes. You can catch that streaming on Facebook or on YouTube. Visit svpride.org for more info. And with that, if you have any additional questions, you're curious about genetics, do feel free to visit the genetics portion of the Tech's website at genetics.thetech.org. Or you can email me directly at askageneticist@thetech.org. I'm happy to answer any additional follow-up questions that you may have. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely evening.